Good morning. Today's date is February 5th, 2008. My name is Thomas Murray. Today I will be conducting an oral history interview with Ellsworth Sammet for the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Dalton Council on Aging. This interview is being held at the Dalton Community Television Studio in Dalton, Massachusetts. Good morning, Sam.
Good morning, Tom.
Could you give us your full name and spell your last name, please?
It's Ellsworth Marcel Sammet, S-A-M-M-E-T.
And where do you presently live, Sam?
I live at Salisbury Estates in Pittsfield on Walsh and Back Circle.
What was your date of birth and where were you born?
My date of birth is January 5th, 1924, and I was born in Fitchburg, Massachusetts.
And did you grow up and go to school there, Sam?
I did, and graduated from Fitchburg High School in the class of 1941.
Mm-hmm. What was it like in school? What did you do in school? Was there anything in particular?
Well, school was pretty busy. It was the day that, or the days that we were just emerging from the Depression. High school was busy. I took the college course, a lot of activities there. I was on a junior-senior relay team, and I was in a class ring committee, and I was the manager of the baseball team, and we had a lot of dances then. In those days, we had junior, senior prom, the senior prom, and a lot of other dances in between. And we enjoyed the time that the big bands were prevalent. And in fact, in 1938, when I was a freshman at Fitchburg High School, we had Artie Shaw as a band. So it was remarkable days.
Yeah. What was it like growing up back then, Sam?
Well, we knew something was happening. I graduated in '41, and of course, got out of high school not really knowing what to do. I always liked the Navy, so that was one possibility. But another possibility is one of my friends in my neighborhood was going down to Bridgeport, Connecticut to work with Chanceford Aircraft. So the family said, why don't you come along and have a job there too? So I went down there with them. I couldn't get a job because I was only 17, and under Connecticut rules, work rules, you had to be 18. So there it left me in limbo what to do. So I decided perhaps the Navy, but my sister was kind of a pusher for me, and she says, well, your friend Bob Buck got accepted at Worcester Polytech. Why don't you apply there? I said, Jesus, right now? This is August. So she said, well, let's go down and see the Dean of Admissions. But ultimately, I was admitted to Worcester Polytech in the class of 1945, starting studies in the first semester in 1941.
Before that, Sam, though, you mentioned a little bit about your growing up in that area, living with your grandfather.
Well, my family lived in my grandfather's six-tenement house in Fitchburg. It was right along the Nashua River, which was a river that was changing colors all the time because upstream there were paper mills, and when the dye of the paper was changed, the river became pink and red and whatever. Next to that was the railroads, and they were very busy at that day, so I was actually getting used to all the time, and of course we did, getting used to all the trains going by, and also the many things that go on in Fitchburg. Fitchburg is a city of many hills, and it's got a big quarry there that was very active in the 1920s and 30s, and I grew up right next to the quarry.
And you mentioned during the Depression it was kind of tough. Food was scarce, and
well, it was. I remember eating a lot of soup. And my family canned a lot of vegetables and fruits, and we had a dirt cellar and many shelves there, and they were usually loaded with produce to carrying us over the winter with the soup.
Now, you mentioned, too, you remembered seeing a dirigible fly over?
Yeah, when I was young, I must have been 10 years old, this big dirigible, and I don't know if it was a Hindenburg or which one it was, a bigger one. It could have been a Navy Shenandoah, but I'm not certain because I looked up in the sky and I see this huge thing flying over, and that was the first time I was ever aware of a dirigible. Beautiful sight.
Yeah. And you also said you were interested in the model airplanes?
Well, I was interested in aviation from a little kid up. I built solid wood models, also these balsa woods models covered with a paper which you put a spray on and it tightened the paper. And when they didn't turn out well, I used to go up in the upper story piazza, as we called them at those days, and light them with a match and let them fly over, because I used to see some of the World War II movies, you know, in those days where they flew the Spads, and Eddie Rickenbacker was a famous pilot in World War I.
Now, you mentioned when you got older, too, you worked in your dad's
Well,
restaurant.
my dad had initially, he was a weaver in the mills, and later on in 1934, I guess, he bought a small gas station that had a little kitchen with it. And later on, he expanded on it and put a dining hall next to it, and I worked in the kitchen and was a shot-outer cook, and that's how I earned all my money to take all those beautiful high school girls out. And down to one of the big places we went to, if you had a good date, you went down to Auburndale, Massachusetts, to the Norumbega Ballroom, and that's where some of the big bands were engaged. And I can remember one particular band was Charlie Barnett. He was a wealthy saxophonist who had his own band. And we used to go down and stand in front of the band and you know, see the singers. And this beautiful singer came on stage, and I looked at her. I said, "Boy, she is beautiful." I didn't realize until about a month later I got a copy of Downbeat magazine, and that had to do with all the musical circles. And in that, I learned that it was Lena Horne that I saw.
Wow.
And that was my first vision of Lena Horne. Beautiful singer, beautiful woman.
Yeah. Now, did you have any brothers and sisters?
I have one sister, Marion Rogers now, and she lives in Nashua, New Hampshire. She's 91 years old.
Wow. And now, you mentioned your dad did have the restaurant. What did he do before that, you mentioned?
Well, he was a weaver and worked in the Park Hill Mills in Fitchburg, and then later on he traveled to Warwick, Rhode Island for a number of years where, you know, he came home on weekends.
And you said your mom worked when she was younger as well.
Well, in those days, very few of the children went through high school.
Yeah.
Of all my uncles and aunts, I only had one uncle that went through Fitchburg High School.
Oh.
The rest of them usually went through the 8th or 9th grade, and that was it.
Yeah.
And they went out to work in the workforce to support the families.
Yeah.
That was the Depression, you know.
Was your dad a veteran?
No, he wasn't.
Now, you did graduate from high school,
Yep.
and that was in '41. And so after we'll get back to, you went to Worcester Polytech.
Right.
And
And at Worcester Polytech, of course, that's September of 1941, and we knew the draft was going to come up sooner or later, so I started thinking about the consequences and what I would join, and I decided it would be the Navy. And at that time, the Navy provided a program in which you could remain in college and get your degree and be commissioned as an ensign in the United States Naval Reserve. I had to take off a couple of weeks to get my left eye up to 1220, which was the lowest range in which they would admit you. And I did get sworn in the Navy Reserve as part of the V-12 program in December of 1942. I chose the Navy because I really wasn't enhanced with the Army, so yeah, I've never regretted it.
yeah. So what after you were accepted into the program, what did you do then?
I continued. That was in December and I was in my sophomore year. I continued to college, but I had a flunking mark in descriptive geometry. I was studying to be an engineer. And the Navy saw my transcript and noticed that I had a failing mark, and they said that you haven't lived up to your end of the bargain, and you have two choices, either to go into Naval Aviation Cadet training or the regular boot camp training. Well, I had trouble with my eyes, and I couldn't pass a physical to get into the aviation cadet training, so I went to the Naval Training Base in Sampson, New York, which is boot camp. And I went through the boot camp training for 8 or 9 weeks, had a week's leave, and at Sampson we had choices presented to us for where we would like to go to study for a rate. And I had 2 choices I wanted, and I got the second choice. Fortunately, it was the second choice, which was Aviation Radioman School.
Now, in boot camp, do you remember any experiences there? I remember you mentioned a story about a guy picking on you.
Yeah, this one fellow, for some reason, was always picking on me for one thing or another. I never knew him before that, but he had this penchant for picking on people, and he centered his attention on me. And at one time, I got sick of his attention on me, and I grabbed him and threw him to the floor, or was pummeling him. And one of my friends there said, "You better stop doing that because the chief will put you on report, and you don't want to have that happen." So I let him go. He never picked on me again.
Sometimes that happens.
You know, spent some time peeling potatoes too, and drill marches and all that other stuff. Yeah.
So then you went to Aviation Radioman School.
I did get the Aviation Radioman School in Norfolk, Virginia, and that was, I think, in probably in June or July of '43. And the radio school was for aviation radiomen to be rear seat gunners on SBD dive bombers or TBFs. Now, TBF is the plane that President Bush I flew, and he was shot down off of Iwo Jima. I was almost through with the training. In fact, it came to September. I was supposed to get a race in the second week of September of '43, and the school blew up. A number of depth charges were being pulled from the ammo dump past the school, between the school and a hangar, on the way to the airfield to be loaded onto PBMs to drop out on the Atlantic, because at that time there was a great sub scare. These subs were very close, sinking a lot of shipping. And that put an end to the radio school. And I did not go to gunnery school. For some strange reason, I got assigned to Quonset Point, Rhode Island. But during the summer of '43, during my studying to be aviation radioman, I went to the skipper, who had been injured on the Yorktown in the Pacific. And I said to him, "Sir, I'd like to be an aviation cadet, and would you, recommend me?" He looked at my record and he said, "Well, you got a good record here. If you can pass a physical, I'll recommend you." Well, there I was. I could hardly get in the Navy with a 12/20 in my left eye. But when I was in high school, my mother introduced me to an osteopathic physician in Fitchburg by the name of Dr. Wilder, and she taught me eye exercises. And during the summer of '43, when I was going to aviation radioman school, I sat out in the afternoons, because we had a morning group and an afternoon group. In the afternoons, I was off, and I sat out in the airfield doing all these eye exercises. So I did take the eye exam, the physical, and I passed it. And I did not know whether or not I would be recommended, but come October of 1943, I was at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, in a Hedron 19 Squadron servicing radio gear on a PV scout plane. And I was called to the office, and they said, "Report such and such a date in November to aviation cadet training." So I went into that, and my first school was at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, and it was called Flight Prep. And then from there, I went to Lock Haven State Teachers College, and that's where we were introduced to flying. We had these Piper Cubs, which are a very small plane. There's still a few of them around. And also Navy N2S biplane. I got about 35 hours there, managed to fly without getting washed out, and then got sent to it was pre-flight, they call it that time. And this was down at Chapel Hill, North Carolina, as part of the University of North Carolina. And this is all physical exercise and ground school. And had about 4 months there, was held over for about almost 6 weeks before being transferred to the Naval Air Station in Memphis, Tennessee. And that was for primary training, yeah.
You had mentioned while you were in this school that the Navy was starting to realize they maybe had too many pilots. And
yes, I was actually in a good spot at that time. This was at Chapel Hill. Of course, it involved no flying, but the Navy told their flight check instructors to wash out a number of pilots if they had the least problem flying, to wash them out. That means discontinue them from the program. But there was no flying at Chapel Hill, and I had excellent marks there, and very few cadets were washed out from studies. And so I was able to continue on, and by that time the Purge, they call it, was ended. And that was at Memphis, Tennessee. I did get there and started to fly the N2S, I think it was, a biplane, primary trainer and got about 110 hours there. I did get one down. As you went through the various stages of familiarization, small field practice, and acrobatics and formation flying, I got it down in C stage, which was acrobatic flying. And the check pilots there were not aviation cadet graduates. They were commissioned from civilian lives. They gave them a direct commission to teach pilot training in the reserves. I did get this one because this one down not having a good snap roll in his estimation. So when that happens, the Navy says you got to have a couple more hours of training, and then you have to have 2-ups. You have to have 2 different instructors, check rides instructors, and then pass the acrobatic maneuvers. So I had a couple more hours of practice with my instructor, who was a great guy, and then I had these 2 checks, and I both passed them. I got ups in both of them. Up is like this, and of course when you ended your flight and the instructor got out of the plane, he went like that. You didn't want to see that.
so now you also mentioned that you had a cross-country flight where you had a slight problem there.
Yeah, the end of that syllabus was a cross-country flight, and this one was to Jonesville, Arkansas. I don't know how many planes, but we had a number of planes in the formation going cross-country, and we landed at the airport in Jonesville, and we're taxiing over to get refueled, and all of a sudden my nose went up, my prop went in the mud, and the engine stopped, and I was sort of hanging there looking down on the ground. I said, wow, what the heck happened here? Well, the plane was righted, and I found out later on that a fire truck had got stuck in the taxiway, which was not paved, and they dug a hole to get one of the wheels out, apparently. So my right wheel went into that hole, and I went up on the nose. But I didn't get any write-up against me because that was deemed to be not my fault, so my record was still clear.
And the plane was all right as well.
The plane was okay, but they didn't want to take a chance on the prop or anything with it. So one of the instructors flew that plane back, and I flew his back to Memphis.
Yeah. So you made it through the primary.
Made it through the primary, and at the end of the primary, it came a decision by the Navy, and there were two things that might happen or would have happened. That was going to multi-engine training, and that was at Pensacola. I was chosen for pilots training in fighter aircraft, and that was at Corpus Christi, Texas at that time. So in about May of 1945, I went to Corpus Christi and started a flight syllabus there.
And that was pretty much the same syllabus, wasn't it? I mean, you
Well,
did
more or less the same syllabus. You
had a little more,
started more in instrument training and also familiarization and gunnery. And the syllabus lasted about 5 months. You expected to get your wings after 5 months if you survived the final squadron. And my date of rank is September 26, 1945, where I was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Naval Reserve. That was quite an experience, and one of my good friends, name was Dutch Schultz, quite a tall fellow, very handsome Midwesterner. He and I hung out together a lot and went to the beaches there off of Texas. And after I graduated, I never saw him. He chose one of two options. The options were after you got your wings, and of course World War II had ended there because the bombs had been dropped and Japan surrendered, and the Navy didn't need all the pilots, but they did give you a choice. Stay in the Navy Reserve for 18 months, and after 18 months, if the Navy wanted you for regular Navy, they would keep you. Otherwise, you could be separated into the United States Naval Reserve. Dutch Schultz chose to stay in. Now, I didn't see him until 1953. I happened to be down in Oceana Naval Air Station on 2 weeks of active training, and at that time we were flying the Corsair, the F-4U Corsair. And I saw Dutch at the end of the bar after flight, and I called him, Dutch, how's things? At that time, he had made lieutenant commander, one rank above me. And so we commiserated and so forth, and I didn't see him and lost all track of him until 2 years ago. I get this magazine from the Naval Museum in Pensacola, and there he is listed as Vice Admiral Dutch Schultz, and I couldn't believe it. And I got in touch with him. In fact, I played golf with somebody who knew him, played the golf up in Maine, and this fellow was a retired Rear Admiral. And I said, did you ever know Dutch Schultz? He said, yeah, I knew Dutch Schultz. Yeah. I said, well, I didn't know how many Vice Admirals there were in the Navy. And I knew that was pretty high, but I lost track. I said, how many Vice Admirals are in the Navy? He said, about 20. And so Dutch rose way up to the top of the Naval Reserve Corps. Not Reserve Corps, but he was full Navy at that time. So now I have been in touch with him, though, and I intend to send him a picture. I have a picture of him that very day that we got our wings, and he's part of the Naval Aviation Museum down in Pensacola. Good.
So you chose the other route.
I chose the other route and was released to inactive duty in the Ready Reserve, and I went back to Worcester Tech. They readmitted me, and I finished 1949 with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. And during that time between 1945 and 49, I did a little bit of flying. We were encouraged to go to Squadron and fly the SNJ Advanced Trainer, which I did. And in 1949, I went out to North Dakota to work for the Army Corps of Engineers as a civil engineer. And there were no training bases around there. The closest one was in Minneapolis, was 500 miles away. The jobs I went to were a levee on the river going into the Missouri, and later on a Garrison Dam. I married a gal from North Dakota who I met. She worked in the hospital when I was there, and we ultimately moved back to Fitchburg, and I got my job back with the Massachusetts Department of Public Works, because I did go to the Massachusetts Department of Public Works in March of 1950. I was disenchanted with the Army Corps of Engineers, so my fraternity brother and I left, went to go to work for the Massachusetts Highway Department, and for a couple of months I did work there, but then I went back out to North Dakota, and Janine and I were married. I worked for a contractor out there for about a month, and we moved back to Fitchburg, and then I continued work with the State Highway Department. And
the dam you worked on, you said that was a huge...
That was a huge dam. It was 2.5 miles long across the Missouri River. The axis of the dam, or let's say the vertical height of the dam, was as high as the state capitol building in Bismarck. That was really a good experience, but I chose to come back to the state because I got more money working for the State Highway Department than I was making with the Army Corps of Engineers. Mm-hmm. So we settled in Ashburnham, and I started to get interested in the reserves again, so I joined a volunteer aviation unit in Fitchburg, and in May of 1952 I asked for 2 weeks of active duty at Squadron and flying the SNJ Advanced Trainer. And at that time, the instructor who checked me out to make sure I could fly the plane again, we did a few landings over at Hanscom. Mm-hmm. Hey, you remember going there? Yeah. And this instructor says, well, why don't you consider joining a reserve unit here? I said, well, I never went through operational training. What that means is, after you got your wings, you went through operational training in the plane you were going to fly in a fleet. Excuse me. He said, that's all right. He said, we'll train you so you'll be fully qualified. And so I was assigned to VF 915. That was a fighter squadron. Mm-hmm. And they had F-6Fs. That was a Hellcat that had a tremendous kill ratio in World War II. It was 19-to-1 kill ratio over the Japanese airplanes. So about 4 or 5 months I flew that. And then the squadron got Corsairs, FG-1D Corsairs, and I flew that until the beginning of 1955. And at that time, we moved out of the Naval Air Station in Squantum to the Naval Air Station in South Weymouth. The reason being, South Weymouth had long runways that could accommodate the jets. Now, Squantum only had short runways, maximum was about 4,000 feet. Mm-hmm. So I had a session with a trainer, what they call a simulator, that had the exact cockpit of the Cougar. The Cougar was the jet we had, the F9F-6, the Cougar. The simulator was beautiful, but we had to operate the simulator without crashing. Of course, this is on the ground, on a pedestal, because if you didn't take it off and land it according to the instruments and so forth, then you couldn't continue into jet training. Well, I got through that. And so the next step was an introductory ride in an advanced trainer, a jet trainer, which was a TV-2. And the TV-2 was a modification of the F-80 Shooting Star. So I went up in the back seat of the TV-2 with an instructor and shot a couple landings from the back seat with him. And the next thing was, a few days later, got into the Cougar, strapped into the Cougar, one seat, and went around South Weymouth and did 5 touch-and-go landings. And so I got qualified that I could handle the Cougar. So from on that, we had several cross-country cruises down to Florida, to Opelika Marine Corps Station. And in 1958, the Navy decided that the 6 Navy jet squadrons, and I was in one of them, as I said, were no longer needed. And I think the reason for that was really that we were no longer needed, was that the jets, of course, allowed, and there was a built-up neighborhood in South Weymouth, and I think the neighborhood got to the politicians, and the Navy then decommissioned the 6 Navy jet squadrons. They did, however, retain 2 Marine squadrons, which we were very jealous of. So What happened then? Well, the Navy then put us into anti-submarine warfare, flying the S-2F, which was 2 props, and a co-pilot, and 2 enlisted men, radio man and an ECM man. This was for detecting submarines underwater, and got checked out on that airplane, and stayed in S-2S until about I think it was 63, and I got transferred to a P-2V squadron, which is long-range bomber that could stay up for 10 hours or so. My last cruise was with the S-2F in 1964, which was to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. My squadron plane and flew down, had a couple stops on the way, and landed at McCullough Field in Guantanamo Bay and operated out of there with submarines. We had a submarine at Pacuda that we toyed with, and they toyed with us, and we tried to find out where they were. But the thing that stands out in my mind at that place is that's at the time that Castro shut the water off. Mm-hmm. And the base was without water at the end of 1963, I think it was. And the Navy had to do something, so immediately they brought big tankers in with millions of gallons of water and pumped that into the base and constructed a desalination plant. And it's interesting, too, that I was in the ready room, ready for a flight one day, and the telephone rang, and is Lieutenant Commander Sammet here? And I said, yeah, somebody wants to talk to you. So I got on the phone, and lo and behold, it was a friend of mine that I knew of him in high school. He went to Fitchburg High School, and he was the chief engineer in building the desalination plant. Mm-hmm. So we went to the Officers Club a few times for dinner and so forth, and that was a nice. Unfortunately, years later, I was working on Route 2, and he came because he was working for a contract, the same contract that I had under me on that project on Route 2. And he says, he introduced himself. I'm Mike. I said, well, good to see you again. I hadn't seen him since Guantanamo Bay. Mm-hmm. This is, in the early 70s I saw him. And I said, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm working for this contractor that you got here. I said, well, good to see you. Unfortunately, I got a clipping from my sister who knew him, and he was on a construction job. And that was the days before they had these warning bells in the back of the trucks and all the other equipment. And he got run over by a big truck. It killed him instantly. Oh. Yeah, so that's what happened to Mike. His name is Mike Essalonis. He lived in Shirley, Mass. He went to Fitchburg High School. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You mentioned that Guantanamo, too. Wasn't that the time they cut all the trees away from the...
Well, Castro decided he didn't want any people going in and out of the place, and we didn't either, because we had guards all over the fence and watchtowers and so forth, but he decided it'd be a good idea for him to clear the area around the base. So he had his people cut all the timber, trees, all the vegetation within maybe 300 to 300 yards from the base, all around the perimeter, right into the ocean. And of course I could see that, when we had flying in our S-2F, but never had a good chance to look over the whole area. And I had a chance to go up in a helicopter with some news people who were really down there keeping track of what was happening, because it was an international incident. And so I took a lot of photos from the helicopter showing the burning of the logs around a whole periphery. And that's what, of course, the helicopter pilot was instructed to do for these news people. So I have a lot of slides showing that, which is another interesting thing in my career. Yeah.
Now, another thing you mentioned, that Cougar you flew, that the Blue Angels were flying that same aircraft.
Yeah, in fact, in 1956, I guess, I was returning from a flight, and I was almost ready to enter the pattern, the flight pattern at Weymouth. And this other Cougar comes right down, and not really close to me, but he's going about 50 knots faster than I am, goes right past me, cuts me off in the landing circle. Who the heck is this guy? I went to the officers' bar after that flight in the evening, and I learned out that guy was a Blue Angel, and he came from Hudson, Massachusetts. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, the Cougar was being flown at the same time that we had them in the Naval Reserve.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that was your last active duty 2 weeks.
The last active duty was flying a P-2V,
Mm-hmm.
a long-range patrol bomber out of South Weymouth. And then at that time I had almost 20 years of satisfactory duty, and I had 3 children and another one on the way in 1966. Jimmy was born in July of 1966. And I opted to resign from the Navy, which I believe was a mistake. But I had a little concern at that time that I might be called up because I had jet experience and go over to Vietnam. But my wife had no relatives here in this state. Mm-hmm. She was from North Dakota, as I explained before. And with 4 children, I said, well, maybe I should, you know, resign and call it a day. So I did go one more year to a ground school in Worcester, Naval Reserve Officers School, 1-3, I guess it was, and got another year. So when I got my discharge from the Navy in July 1st, 1966, I had 21 and a half years of satisfactory service. So the Navy rules and the retirement rules in the services, all the services, where you had, if you had satisfactory service of over 20 years, you would get a pension. Mm-hmm. If you lived to be 60. You had to live to be 60. Right. And you know that. And I did live to be 60, and in 1984, I think it was, I started to collect retirement pay as a retired lieutenant commander. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so life is good. And I was very fortunate in all my days in the Navy.
So where were you discharged from? Did you actually?
Well, I was discharged by letter. I sent a letter, resigning, and it went through my commanding officer at South Weymouth, and then up through the captain of South Weymouth and into the naval hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And I got discharged on, as I said before, right. July 1st, 1966.
And you said you did have mixed feelings about that.
The Navy treated me so well. I got more out of the Navy than I think I ever put in it, because I went through radio school. I went from an enlisted man to an officer. You know, good things happened all the time. It was just a great experience. And I'm here alive, and I'm collecting, retirement pay. Mm-hmm. And what could be better?
And you mentioned what they call
a Mustang, a Mustang. Yeah. Well, entering the Navy and going through boot camp, being an enlisted man, and then getting commissioned, the name for that was a Mustang. You're a Mustang. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of good too.
Yeah, yeah. Now you mentioned about adjusting back to civilian life. It really wasn't that, because you were kind of both, a civilian and...
That was both, because had 2 weeks of active duty every year, and then sometimes I took an extra 2 weeks, and then every month I'd have flight duty at South Weymouth, or before that, Squadron. So I'd fly on the weekends, and sometimes I go down there Friday night and take a flight to get extra points and extra experience. And I was still a civilian, and at that time I was a resident engineer with the State Highway Department, and I was involved with a lot of sections of Route 2. Mm-hmm. The Gardner interchange, the section from Westminster up to Phillipston, a couple of sections in Phillipston. And, I was a civilian, but, I was still flying and enjoying flying. I had great people in the squadrons that I was in. The one I favored the most was my fighter squadron, because they're a little different clique. The people, some of them had kills during World War II. Larry Urbano was a friend of mine too, and he became a judge in the Superior Court in Springfield. And he came from Williamstown. He was a selectman up in Williamstown. And he had about 3 kills in flying the F6F Hellcat. And when we got into jets, we mellowed into jets, and we're just a very homogeneous group of people. I was sorry that the Navy did disband the jet squadron, because that was a highlight of my life, actually, flying jets.
Now, what were some of your work experiences besides Route 2?
Well, Route 2 was part of District 3 of the State Highway Department. And for about 15 years, I was a resident engineer on many projects, some of them which I just mentioned. And I got a promotion to supervisor, which was a senior civil engineer, and then I was transferred to District 2 to work on I-91 out of the Northampton office of District 2. And I got a lot of experience there working on District 2, supervising several of the jobs. What I did then, I was supervising resident engineers. I was a supervisor of them, and the sections were the Greenfield, Deerfield, and also East Hampton, and also the big interchange of I-91 and 391. I was overall supervisor of that. I had a couple residents on the job at all times, but I used to go down there and check on the jobs and so forth. That was very, very interesting. Then I got another promotion to be district construction engineer. I could have stayed in Worcester because I was still living in Ashburnham, traveling back and forth to Northampton. And for the first year, after I accepted the job to come out here in the Berkshires to work as the district construction engineer, I was still commuting from Ashburnham to Lenox. And that got to be tiresome, so I finally bought a house in Pittsfield, which is on Valentine Road. And that's where I spent the rest of my time. I became the district highway engineer for about 5 years total, and retired from the State Highway Department in 1989. And that was a great experience too. My feeling about that was Dean Amadon was a district highway engineer at that time, and he was a classmate of mine at Worcester Tech. And he says, take your promotion out here with me because we're going to build the Pittsfield bypass. Well, having just got off of I-91 and having all the experience I had, you know, those big jobs, I thought, geez, this would be great, you know. I could then supervise the construction of the bypass around Pittsfield. Well, that was 1971. I came out here, and lo and behold, I think some of the old timers here will remember that it did not fly, and of course it went up and went down. In fact, I thought it was going to happen when I was district highway engineer in 1988, but that didn't happen either. The town didn't back it, the city didn't back it, and the politicians didn't back it. The local politicians did not come out in real favor of it. The only local one that I can remember that voiced approval of it was Jack Fitzpatrick, who was a senator from Great Barrington at that time. He was for it, and also Mayor Butler was for it. But as far as some of the others in the city council, they never voiced any support, and the Eagle never did. And disappointingly, the General Electric Corporation never really came out full voice for the bypass.
Now, you mentioned you did marry and have a family. How many children did you have?
4 children, yeah.
And they're all, you mentioned they're all doing well, and one followed kind of in your footsteps.
Yeah, well, James is the youngest one. In fact, he just got married, and the announcement is in last Sunday's paper, that which would be the, February, February 3rd. And he was married in Maui, Hawaii, and my family went out there. I lost my wife in December of '04, but the other children went out there, and we attended the marriage. They now live in Snoqualmie Pass, right on the top of I-90 in the Cascades of state of Washington. He graduated from the University of Massachusetts as a civil engineer in 1989, and then went out to the state of Washington, worked for the DOT out there, and then several consultants. He's working for a consultant now, and the consultant now is getting into wind farms. Jim is now project director of 3 large wind farm contracts in the state of Washington, Oregon, and the Mojave Desert in California. And he just announced the other day that he's going to be a papa.
Oh, good.
So
Good
you
for
married
him,
late,
yeah.
and but things are going well.
Yeah. And the rest of your children, do they live in the area?
Well, Lisa is a librarian in a small town of Craftsbury, Vermont. She's got her own library. She has an MS in library science, and she's a real Vermonter now. Margot is a teacher, teaches first grade in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. My oldest son, Jonathan, is in East Hampton. He had some medical problems and was in the VA because he was on submarines for a while. He was 4 years on submarines in the Pacific, in one of the Polaris firing submarines. And he's in East Hampton recovering and so forth. He's coming along well.
Good, good. Did you ever join any veterans? Or
No, I didn't. Maybe because I was never that close to him initially, and I never got involved, although I do belong to the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. I've been down there several times. It's a tremendous museum. They restore airplanes. They pick airplanes out of the ocean. I remember they picked a plane out of an SBD out of Lake Michigan that went down off of a carrier that was doing checkout time for young pilots, and they fully restored that. The beautiful place, a lot going on in there, and as I say, one of the most beautiful museums that I ever seen. There's a lot of museums around that have aircraft in them, but this is a special place.
Did you keep in touch with any of your friends or buddies?
Well, as flying jets, one of the pilots was Bill Wilkinson, and he and I used to room together, and then he and I flew in the same division. And one day we were in the BOQ, Bachelor's Officers Quarter. He was studying a publication. I said, "What you doing, Bill?" He said, "Well, I'm going to study the Air Transport Pilot's manual here." He said, "I think I'm going to give a shot at the transport pilot or the civilian pilots to train." And he made it. And he worked for American Airlines doing a lot of overseas routes, and got retired from American Airlines at the age 60. And he lives in Punta Gorda, Florida. Another one who lives in Florida, he actually lives in Pensacola, is Bill Milne. He was in FGs with me. That's the Corsair, and he's still living. He lost his wife, and we correspond and also talk on the telephone. Locally, Bill Giftos was a great friend of mine. Bill died a couple of years ago, and he flew off the Bismarck Sea, which was sunk by a kamikaze attack, and he survived in the water overnight and was picked up. And he flew F-4Fs, Wildcats, which was kind of a small fighter, one of the first real good fighters. And he did duty flying captains over the fleet, protecting the fleet. And he had a lot of experience, a lot of flight time, a lot of stories. He was a great guy. Another fellow I just met was Lou Gianovetti, and I met him just last year. I joined a group called the Geritol set, golfing at Skyline. There's a group of people retired, a lot of them retired, and a lot of them fellows there worked for me when I was head of the highway department. And Lou flew in the Navy. He went through cadet training right after the war, and was in the Navy for about 4 years. He's still very active, and I like playing golf with him, and that's another touch I had. A fellow in the Rotary Club, Don Ferry, his father was a naval aviator. I didn't have a chance to meet him. lives in Florida and hasn't been up, but I look forward to meeting him. Sometimes he's up visiting his son. Yeah.
Now, you alluded to it before, but did the military have a positive or negative effect on you?
I think I addressed that before.
Yeah.
It had tremendously positive. You know, I did well in the Navy, as I said. Met a lot of great people. I think, actually, going beyond there, I think one of the best things this country could do is have universal military training. It certainly did me a lot of good. Not that I was a problem person when I was a young person, but you know, I think it would be good. It would provide a lot of training. The training you get in the armed forces is extraordinary. I think you went through radioman training, and I think you can attest to the same fact. And you did well in the Navy too in your career. And I think this would be a big asset to the country. Certainly the biggest asset to this country was the training provided by the GI Bill of Rights. Now, I didn't have enough money to pay for college education after I got out of the Navy, but I had the GI Bill of Rights that paid my full tuition and $75 a month. Now, you know, adding all this up, it couldn't have been better. You know, I just got to say I had a good life, and I would recommend anybody that could follow in my footsteps.
Yeah. Now, I know we have a few pictures to look at, so why don't we do that now?
Okay?
Okay, Sam, what's this picture here?
Well, this is a picture of myself at Fitchburg High School on a track area, and this is when I participated in the junior-senior relay. This was an event that went on for years and years, and where the junior class would race against the senior class, and of course try to be the winner for each one of your class. So I did that for both years. I was junior and a senior at Fitchburg High School. This picture is the Totem Pole Ballroom, a very popular place I mentioned earlier, and it's at Norumbega Park in Auburndale, Massachusetts, I believe. And you can see there's all these tiered sofas in which you took your extra special date. And to the lower left of the dance floor is where the stage was, and that's where the most popular bands of the day came. It was a great night, and went down there quite a few times.
Is that still there, Sam? Or is that
No, it went by the boards of all the dance places. I guess there was some dance places here in Pittsfield too, but that was the end of an era where the singers came in. Now, this is the picture of my application to the Navy in December of 1942. This picture here is a scene of the blast remains of the number of depth charges that went off between a hangar. I think that's part of the hangar, and on the left part of this picture is part of the school. And this killed about 24 people and injured 250. I was on one side of the school building, and the wall came down but didn't collapse on us in the classroom. We went out and started to help all the people who were injured and put them in litters and so forth. It was a very devastating thing, and this actually was the ending of my phase as far as being an aviation radioman gunner, because I did not go to gunnery school.
Right. This kind of just shows you didn't have to be on the front lines to be in danger of things happening.
Weird things happen right on the states, and this is one of them. It was a big catastrophe. And this picture here is at flight prep at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. I am in the first row between the two gentlemen squatting. Now, this picture here, I think, is part of the campus at Wesleyan University. That was about a 3 months tour.
Yeah.
This picture is the biplane at Lock Haven State Teachers College. It was called an N-2S, a Navy manufactured plane. We got a few hours. I probably got about 8 or 10 hours in that. And that was in the final part of the Lock Haven pilot training in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
This is another picture of the same aircraft. It looks like a World War I
Yeah.
plane that Eddie Rickenbacker might have flown, a SPAD or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is at Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I went for physical training. And no flight training there. It was all ground school and physical training. Ground school, half a day physical training, the other half a day. And this was called Chapel Hill. This was the tower at Chapel Hill. I think it's still there.
I remember your inscription on the picture there. You said the pilots from one of the air stations like that. Was that like a marker they would?
Yeah, the pilots from Cherry Point Marine Corps Station used to fly over and give us a little thrill, you know, because a lot of them had gone through Chapel Hill too, so they liked to fly over, and we took a lot of satisfaction in looking up and saying, well, maybe someday I may be up there with them.
You, huh?
This gentleman here graduated with me from flight training at Corpus Christi. His name is Dutch Schultz. And he and I were very, very friendly in our last weeks in Final Squadron at Corpus Christi. Now, in 1953, when I was flying with the VF-915, I had 2 weeks of active duty down at Oceana Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, or near Norfolk. And this is, I think, I said 1953. I looked down the end of the bar. We went to the bar usually after flying, which, you know, was our custom. And I looked down the end of the bar, and there's Dutch Schultz. Hadn't seen him since 1945. So we got reacquainted, and he was in the fighter squadron at that time, flying jets. And I was still flying the F-4U Corsair. And so we just touched bases for a while and never saw him again. In 3 years ago, I said, I had a copy of the magazine that the Naval Aviation Museum puts out, and there his name is listed, and where he came from. I said, gee, I'll have to look up, see if that's the same place that my Dutch Schultz came from. So I looked up, yeah, it was Omaha, Nebraska, I think. And I said, that's the same fellow. And he became a vice admiral in the Navy.
So he did that other route.
Yeah, he did the other route. He chose to stay in. At the 18 months, the Navy accepted him for USN, they call regular Navy. They sent him through college and various armed force institutes and Navy War College. And lo and behold, became one of the few vice admirals in the Navy.
Yeah.
An outstanding gentleman. This picture is myself. The same day I just showed the picture of Dutch Schultz. This is a picture of myself outside the quarters where we lived.
When you got your
graduation day, September 26, 1945.
Yeah.
This is the SNJ trainer that we flew in final squadrons before we were commissioned. But there was one other plane that we flew for about 16 hours, and that was the Douglas Dauntless. It was the dive bomber that was used in the Pacific, and when they sank 3 of the Japanese carriers as one of the most successful planes ever built, actually. And we were given the chance to get 15 hours, and that was before we were commissioned. So right after that, we were commissioned, and this was called pre-op, because this was an operational plane, and they called this phase pre-operational flying.
Yeah.
And this is a picture of one of the P2Vs that did duty in long-range patrol. I flew that for one like it for about 2 years.
Yeah. You didn't care for that plane too much, did you?
I didn't care for that much, no.
Yeah.
No. This is the the jet trainer, the TV-2 that I spoke about, two-place with a Czech pilot in the front, and I had a chance to do a few landings in that before going into the Cougar. And this is a picture of the Cougar.
Yeah.
And this
nice.
was out of the Worcester Telegram that did an article about local aviators that were flying the Cougar out of South Weymouth. And this was the first operational jet with swept back wings that the Navy had. It did carrier duty and was quite successful for a few years. But then it was superseded by other jets aircraft.
Yeah.
That was a great aircraft.
Well, Sam, we want to thank you for taking the time to do this project, and we thank you for your service to the country. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's been a pleasure.